Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. For decades, Bernard Madoff was one of the most trusted names in American finance. Institutional investors, charitable foundations, and ordinary retirees sent him their savings and never asked too many questions. Why would they? His returns were consistent. His reputation was immaculate. His offices occupied the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan, and if you were lucky enough to be accepted as a client, it felt like joining an exclusive club. Then, in December 2008, the entire edifice collapsed. In a single confession, Madoff admitted to his sons that his investment advisory business was, in his own words, one big lie. What followed was the largest individual financial fraud in recorded history. A scheme that had run for decades, swallowed an estimated $65 billion in claimed client assets, and destroyed the savings of thousands of people around the world. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born in Queens, New York in 1938. He founded Bernard L. Fingers Madoff Investment Securities in 1960 with $5,000 saved from working as a lifeguard and a garden sprinkler installer. Over the following decades, he built a legitimate brokerage business that became one of the largest market makers on Wall Street. He was an early adopter of electronic trading, a pioneer who helped build the technological infrastructure that would eventually become NASDAQ, and he served as its non-executive chairman in the early 1990s. This legitimate success is central to understanding how the fraud worked. Madoff was not a stranger promoting an implausible scheme from the margins. He was an industry insider of the highest order, respected, decorated, and deeply connected. When he told investors their money was being managed through a sophisticated split-strike conversion strategy, almost no one pushed back hard enough. His credibility was the instrument of the crime. The precise date on which Madoff began defrauding clients remains uncertain. At his sentencing, he claimed the fraud began in the early 1990s during a period of economic recession. Federal investigators and the court-appointed trustee, Irving Picard, concluded it likely started far earlier, possibly as far back as the 1970s or early 1980s. Whatever its true origin, by the time it unraveled, the fraud had almost certainly been running for at least 20 years. The mechanism was a classic Ponzi scheme. New investor money was used to pay returns to existing investors, with no actual trading taking place in the investment advisory arm of the business. Madoff maintained a separate custodial account at JPMorgan Chase in New York, through which billions of dollars in client funds flowed without ever being invested in securities. Month after month, fabricated account statements were sent to clients showing steady, attractive returns regardless of what the broader market was doing. The consistency of those returns was itself a warning sign that several observers noticed. Legitimate investment strategies do not produce smooth, uninterrupted gains through bull markets and crashes alike. Markets do not work that way. One observer pursued this inconsistency with particular determination. Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst and fraud investigator, submitted detailed written warnings to the Securities and Exchange Commission as early as 1999. He submitted follow-up analyses in 2001 and again in 2005, each time providing specific mathematical evidence that Madoff's claimed returns were statistically impossible. The SEC investigated Madoff multiple times over the years, but never uncovered the fraud. Markopoulos later testified before Congress that regulators lacked the financial expertise to recognize what they were looking at. The failure of the SEC to act on Markopoulos's warnings represents one of the most significant regulatory breakdowns in modern financial history. The question that has never been fully answered is whether that failure was purely one of analytical incompetence, or whether the institutional prestige surrounding Madoff's name created a culture of deference that allowed the fraud to survive repeated scrutiny intact. Madoff understood the value of exclusivity. He cultivated a deliberate aura of selectivity around his fund, turning investors away or keeping them waiting, which reinforced the perception that access to his advisory arm was a privilege rather than a product. Feeder funds, investment vehicles that pooled client money and channeled it into Madoff's operation, charged their own fees for that access, adding an additional layer between ordinary investors and any meaningful independent analysis. By December 2008, the global financial crisis had triggered a wave of redemption requests from clients who urgently needed their money back. Madoff could not meet the demand. He had approximately $200 to $300 million remaining in client accounts against $7 billion in outstanding redemption requests. On the evening of December 10, 2008, he confessed to his sons Mark and Andrew that his investment advisory business was entirely fraudulent. His sons reported him to federal authorities the following morning. On December 11, 2008, Bernard Madoff was arrested at his Manhattan apartment. In March 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felony counts including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He was sentenced in June 2009 to 150 years in federal prison. Judge Denny Chin, who imposed the sentence, noted that the fraud was unprecedented and, in his characterization, extraordinarily evil. The human cost was staggering. Official account statements showed approximately $65 billion in fictitious client balances. The actual cash principal lost, money that real people had deposited and could never recover, was estimated by the trustee at approximately $17 billion. Victims included individuals who had entrusted their entire retirement savings to Madoff, charitable foundations whose endowments were wiped out overnight, banks across Europe and the United States, and dozens of feeder funds that had raised money from thousands of additional investors who never knew their capital had been concentrated in a single fraudulent operation. The impact on charitable organizations was particularly severe. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost virtually its entire endowment. Scores of other non-profits serving Jewish communities, hospitals, and educational institutions were similarly devastated. A direct consequence of Madoff having cultivated much of his client base within Jewish philanthropic networks over many years, exploiting the trust that community ties and shared social circles generate. Irving Pickard, appointed by the courts as the SIPC trustee to recover assets for victims, pursued a wide-ranging legal strategy that targeted feeder funds, banks that had profited from the arrangement, and early investors who had withdrawn gains generated by the fraud. By the mid-2020s, his team had recovered and distributed more than $14 billion to victims, a remarkable outcome by the historical standards of fraud recovery, though one that still left many investors with substantial unrecovered losses. The Madoff case carries several lessons that remain relevant long after the verdict. The first is the danger of misreading consistency. In financial markets, returns that are too smooth and too reliable are a warning sign, not a reassurance. Volatility is a normal feature of legitimate investment. When a strategy appears immune to market conditions across years and across economic cycles, the most likely explanation is not genius, it is fraud. The second is the failure of institutional trust as a substitute for independent verification. Madoff's reputation, his professional credentials, and his social standing effectively acted as a shield against scrutiny. The investors and intermediaries who failed to conduct their own due diligence were not all naive. Many were sophisticated professionals who allowed prestige to do the work that analysis should have done. Status is not a financial instrument, but it was treated as one. The third is the cost of regulatory failure. Harry Markopolos handed the SEC a detailed roadmap to the fraud years before the collapse, complete with mathematical evidence. Regulatory agencies need both the technical capacity and the institutional culture to pursue credible warnings seriously, even, and perhaps especially, when the suspect is prominent, well-connected, and widely admired. Bernard Madoff died in federal prison on April 14, 2021, at the age of 82. He had served just 12 years of his 150-year sentence. In the years before his death, he gave occasional interviews in which he expressed regret, though whether that regret was genuine or a final performance remained a question his victims were left to answer for themselves. What endures from the Madoff scandal is not simply the scale of the theft, but what it exposed about the systems that were supposed to prevent it. Regulators failed. Gatekeepers failed. The culture of deference surrounding a powerful man's reputation allowed a fraud to survive long after it should have been stopped. Every mechanism designed to protect investors, auditors, feeder fund managers, regulatory oversight, basic due diligence, was either bypassed or ignored. And that raises a question that the case leaves permanently open. If the largest Ponzi scheme in history can run for decades inside one of the most heavily regulated financial systems in the world, quietly surviving multiple formal investigations, what else might still be running that no one has found yet? Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.